Most people think that US, Israel, and Iran are in a war. If this were a genuine war, the price of gold would have been through the roof with oil. If it's closed for 2 months and the price of oil hits 150 or above, we're in global financial crisis, recession, just worse than 2008. Everything breaks. You have to crash the price of oil, and you need to have done it yesterday. That's reality. And the only way to do that is to have a deal. The second the Strait is open again, we are in a completely different world. The big print is coming. There is no alternative but big print after this. The West is going to get worse and worse. US empire is over officially today.
Archie.
So about 17 days ago, the United States, led by the nose, followed Israel into an attack on Iran. Let's start with why.
Okay, so last time we did a podcast, I talked about Fink, financial industrial complex, asset managers, investment banks, private equity, venture capital, retail banks that create fiat currencies.
Mm-hmm.
MIC, Palantir, cybersecurity operations, big
military
weaponry,
industrial complex. That's, yeah.
UK, Germany,
Mm-hmm.
France, Israel, American corporate interest,
Mm-hmm.
Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, BAE Systems, all those types of things. Technical industrial complex, the big magnificent seven, algorithms, data, X, Palantir, all that stuff. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the three powers that control the West. And they want leverage over other countries that may be more sovereign. Those countries are sovereign if they manage to keep a central bank that genuinely optimizes for their own people, like the People's Bank of China.
Mm-hmm.
They manage to keep their resources away from the IMF, and they put it into a sovereign wealth fund. Those are the three components of sovereignty at the corporate level. Central bank that's optimized for your people, resources that are optimized for your people, and a sovereign wealth fund that allows you to negotiate with the financial industrial complex and persuade them not to kill you or assassinate you or regime change you, or take your resources or take you to a forever war or whatever the MIC want to do. Okay, so most people think that right now there is a war between US, Israel, and Iran. I personally believe there is a power struggle between MIC and Fink and TIC. So who are the MIC? I think the best way to understand the Iran war is by studying what we know from declassified documents. There are two very important declassified documents that help us understand the Iran war. One is Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was the overthrowing of the democratically elected government in Iran for British Petroleum, which was executed by the CIA and MI6 in 1953. And this was all around. British Petroleum was receiving 80% of all the oil, and Iran was allowed to keep 20%. And when later there was a democratically elected government that wanted to nationalize the oil, they needed to install their own puppet government, which was the Shah. And so what did they do? They created civil unrest in the country. They did a currency war in order to destroy the value of the currency. They then used sanctions in order to make it economically very dissatisfying for the people because of that. They then paid the media to create stories around the leadership, and then they killed people and shot people and said it was the leader. And then they weaponized the media, civil unrest, sanctions, and currency war in order to create an uprising. And then a military coup would then combine, and then they would regime change, overthrow the government with a puppet and a democrat and a dictator. And they had to use all the resources for British Petroleum. And it was a joint operation between the CIA and MI6 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that helps you understand Operation Ajax. I think we witnessed Operation Ajax 2.0 before this war. Same tactics. Then look at the Iran-Contra affair, which was in the 70s and 80s, so 79, 80s. So Khomeini, the grand leader, was in exile in France. And then suddenly there was an uprising that was agitated by intelligence that led to hostage taking of US hostages and a negotiation. Many years later, it was revealed via the Iran-Contra documents that effectively US was sending money to Israel. Israel was purchasing weapons from the military-industrial complex and then giving those weapons to the IRGC and the Revolutionary Guard. And then they were trafficking. They could say it was them, it wasn't us, trying to blame it on the IRGC. And they were trafficking those weapons to Central and South America, to Nicaragua, and funding the Contras, which was a militia group that was ensuring that the CIA got access to all their drug trafficking routes. And it was done via Credit Suisse as the money laundering bank. So Iran, US, and Israel were working together around the time of the hostage taking. And then what did America do? Well, they gave chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And then they agitated a war between Iraq and Iran. And that built what we know as the IRGC's military-industrial complex today. Prior to that, Israel, after the 67 war, was obviously always an outpost for US military. So then you start seeing things like the revolution. You get the construction of the Islamist terrorist narrative. Later, we have Saudi intelligence working with CIA to create Wahhabi Islamic ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and to take down the towers, in that CIA Mossad Saudi intelligence hub.
Just a point. It had already, that school of, religious theology was already created, but they started propagating and weaponizing that throughout the world at the time that you're talking about.
They infiltrated and created a cult and do what they've always done, which is you create a bunch of people that don't know the religion that join a cult and they're told what their religion is. And then their religion is they're told that they're in a holy war and a jihad and various other things. Mm-hmm. And so then you create a terrorist factory, which is a book you can read about, Terrorist Factory. You can read about covert regime changes, all of these different, takes all the CIA documents and help you understand it. Read a book called Operation Gladio by Paul Williams. It talks about this concept of strategic tension. Strategic tension is you fund both sides of opposing sides, and you continually make sure they're fighting each other. Okay? You never allow them to destroy the infrastructure, but you create divide and conquer so they can never unify. And then the easiest thing to weaponize is religion. So you create the evangelical, radicalized Christians in America. You create the Jews that are radicalized into Zionism, give me back my land. And you create the quote unquote Islamist terrorist, based upon these misinterpretations of the Quran and hadiths and various scripture. Okay, so these are very complicated operations that they create. The idea was that you have one side saying death to America, death to Israel. You have another side that says, come join the IDF because the Jews need you, and engage in the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians. Another side, Saudi, after King Faisal, remember he was assassinated because after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, he basically did an oil blockade embargo that pushed the price of oil up. Then later he was assassinated, and then George Bush created the Safari Club with the regime change, Saudi Arabia, that started all of these operations that led to Twin Towers, Al-Qaeda, all this type of stuff. In Iraq, they immediately got them to fight each other. They gave one side chemical weapons, the other side. So you created strategic tension across the Middle East. Then in 1973, this led to the creation of the petrodollar. So now you prop up the dollar via...
Just explain. The petrodollar was the agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia that Saudi would only sell oil denominated in US dollars.
Exactly, yeah.
And then that would be funneled into US treasuries.
And then when you end up with excess dollars, you don't hold them in a bank. You buy US treasuries to lend to the US government. The currency strengthens. You lend more to the government. And then they can further their military industrial complex to fund more covert operations to take over more parts of the world.
And just one more point, because it's going to be relevant later on. And in return, so Saudi Arabia sells their oil for printed money, and then they use that money to buy US treasuries, which is essentially US government debt.
Yeah.
In return for a security guarantee. Basically, not necessarily of the country, but more or less of the monarchy to remain in power.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so then they get a US base in their country that provides them the defense, and they have to spend some of that money on the military industrial complex, and they lend the rest back through the financial industrial complex. They then build up all this dollar wealth because America also needs to buy oil. And so America gets its energy, Saudi gets its defense. And if you're holding your reserves in dollars and the value's going up because it's continually going up, then you're okay and you continue to do that. And this effectively was a mechanism for enforcing demand for the dollar and rolling over the debt-based Ponzi scheme of the American empire. They did several relationships like this, but to keep it simple, you had effectively strategic tension in the Middle East and the propping up of the petrodollar. You had 40 years of media narrative. The radical extremists are about to get a nuclear bomb. And so Israel continually provides that narrative. They want to kill the Jews. We need to keep getting defense. America, give us $3 billion, give us $10 billion. And they would strategically keep mowing the lawn in Palestine. Remember, and then what would Iran do? Iran would try and get leverage by funding different militia groups in different countries. So they did Yemen with the Houthis. They did Hezbollah in Lebanon after the 1982 war. They did the Hamas in Gaza. And then they had different militias in Iraqi interests after the Iraq war. After the Iraqi invasion. And then obviously they had all the Syria, which was just a big mess. I don't even want to go in those. Moving a lot of history, but let's get to where we are. What was the key thing? Trump administration 1, fracking, America becomes energy independent. They now produce their oil and they produce their LNG, and they're now exporters. Like they're selling oil and they're selling gas. Okay, so we don't need to buy anything from Saudi anymore. So what does Saudi do? Saudi and the Gulf countries, they say, well, let's invest in your Texas oil refiners and Texas LNG and infrastructure. And so the Gulf countries invest and build up America's own refiners and their own industry. Now they're competitors, so they have to hedge their bet by owning those companies. And so they own a bunch of the infrastructure. No one can, America can produce oil at like $40. Saudi can do it at like $2 to $10. China's got the manufacturing base, but now America's not buying any of the oil and gas. Who is buying the gas? The manufacturing base. So China basically is buying Venezuelan oil, Gulf countries oil, Iranian oil, Guyanan oil, anywhere they can get oil from or gas from. Simultaneously, they're building out the largest infrastructure for alternative and renewable energy, wind farming, solar farming, everything they can, hydro farming, like every type of energy. America's becoming a gambling tool, collateralized debt obligation. The people are all in debt. The corporates are all loaded up with corporate debt, which means they're owned by Fink. And the government is 100%, $40 trillion in debt, coming. So Fink owns the government, the corporate entities, and the people. And now 92% of the value of the stock market is owned by 10% of the people. And those 10% of the people are propping up the whole consumption of the economy, unless you can give people more debt. And so people start spending on credit cards, people start getting auto loans, people start getting debt on burritos. Like they're borrowing to buy food.
Yeah.
Like literally,
That's quite an unbelievable thing. Just to see that option when you're buying something online is, do you want to split this payment into over 3 months? And it's like literally a burger.
So the dollar's going up in value. They're printing more and more money because the government is a collateralized debt obligation for corporate interest. That's causing inflation. The cost of living's going up, and they're supplementing more and more Americans are supplementing their consumption habits with debt. And so they create subscription services for everything. You don't own anything. You will own nothing and be happy. World Economic Forum says, screw it. You don't need cars. Just rent your car. Just use Uber. You don't need houses. That's just for the rich. You get a tiny electric house, or you become the renter. You become the serfs. Okay. And so this is getting worse and worse and worse. Meanwhile, in America, suicide rates are up, drug addiction's up. Those drug routes are still protected by the CIA and the cartels. Every time you want a war, you pretend you're taking on drugs. Anytime you want oil, you pretend you're taking on terrorism. Anytime you want some other type of rare earth resources, you pretend you're taking on communism. And you just create narrative that radicalizes all the American people to think you're, while things are getting worse and worse and worse, but they can't quite put it together, and so they're turning to drugs. Women are turning to OnlyFans for jobs. Men are addicted to pornography. Men and women hate each other. Birth rates are collapsing. And where are all the birth rates? They're still in Africa. They're in these the highest birth rates are in the Middle East and Africa. So the companies and the World Economic Forum and the Davos class are saying, kind of got everything we can here. China's the manufacturing base. Middle East is the oil. America's, getting more and more degenerate. What are we going to do next? Let's destroy Europe. Blow up Nord Stream pipeline. Agitate a war via NATO and CIA with Russia. Make them energy dependent upon US.
Mm-hmm.
And Qatar does a deal. They get to import some of their energy from Qatar, and Qatar invests in infrastructure in the US. So now you've got you've got all Chinese money propping up the sovereign wealth funds and the energy companies, and then they're buying US equities, and they become the source of capital for America. Because all of Americans, all their money is being managed by BlackRock via ETFs and pension funds and endowments. They're all in debt, so they're a product of the banks. You've basically taken the entire America and made it 70% service-based, 30% goods. And now America can't produce an F-35 fighter jet or a drone or a missile without China. And the American nuclear weapons buy highly enriched uranium from Russia. And they decide to wage a covert war on Russia. What happens to Europe? They lose their energy. Then they say, BlackRock comes out and says ESG.
Well, specifically, they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline so that Russia couldn't sell energy into Europe.
Yeah, so you could destroy the manufacturing base of Germany. Germany required cheap energy to build it, to have a manufacturing base. You take away cheap energy, you've got no manufacturing base. No manufacturing base, that destroyed Europe is effectively big Germany. And the European Union is a product of the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. And so the European Union has these unelected officials that work for the Bank for International Settlements that effectively do nothing but print money and give it to Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, the military industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
They implement policy that destroys energy. Even in the UK, what was the thing we did? We decide in our infinite wisdom, and I can't put this down to stupidity. I can put this down to capture, but not stupidity. We decide to do a windfall tax on the North Sea oil energy structure that destroys all of the North Sea oil production. And then we decide to take all of the non-DOMs that live in the UK and say to them, you're going to be taxed on your worldwide wealth. where do they all go? Every millionaire and billionaire flees to Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly Dubai is pushing out, and we've got this whole Islamic invasion narrative. We've got the destruction of the energy infrastructure. We've got population fleeing to the Middle East and the Gulf countries. You get rid of all your millionaires and billionaires. Tax revenue goes down. And then what do? You say, I know, wealth tax. So now you've got to be taxed on all your assets. That crashes the market. You crash the market. BlackRock buys up all of the real estate, makes everyone serfs. The cost of energy goes up. What's happening in all this time? The economy is getting worse. Immigration and demographic changes are creating tensions. The pre-crime Palantir technology is being rolled out. We're getting more and more. We get a beta test of what they're about to do in America. You get arrested for your social media posts. Meanwhile, the stock market is at all-time highs in the UK, and debt is at all-time highs, and birth rates are at all-time lows.
Yeah,
this is complete asset stripping of the West, into the stock markets. And then what are they doing with that stock value? They're reallocating capital around other parts of the world that don't have the demographic issues. And what are they going to do? Then they create structural unemployment, and you need AI and robotics to replace all the humans. And then you put them on a UBI and a social credit score to make sure they stay at home, and a stable coin to have
most people are
money.
effectively on a subsistence income anyway.
Yes.
And they don't realize it.
Yes.
So like when this UBI thing comes in, I don't even know how that's going to work. Like, does anybody even have an idea of how that's going to work?
Elon seems to know how it's going to work. He says it's going to be a utopia.
No, what does he say? Universal high income. And I just think it's completely ridiculous, because the economic and political system that we have at the moment is based on property rights right now, right? And so no one's been able to explain where this money for just universal basic income is going to come from. If they're going to tax, what are they going to tax? At what levels are they going to tax? We are already seeing now. It's not the statutory tax rates that are the problem. It's the effective tax rates that are so low, combined with the inefficiencies of government spending as well. That's got us in the situation that we are in all Western countries, where we're running deficits just to infinity.
And tax revenue's down. Growth is at 1%.
Yeah.
Now we've got an oil crisis.
Yeah. But we don't have proper industrial policy to begin with. So what is the actual purpose of the economy here? Do we have a winning industry at all?
No. There's only one way of explaining it. Keir Starmer doesn't work for the Brits. The European Union don't work for the Europeans, and the American government doesn't work for the Americans, and the Israeli government doesn't work for the Israelis either. Even though people think Israel as a jurisdiction rules the world, they're in the same structure. They're being structurally asset stripped and loaded up with debt.
Okay.
But anyway, so we were doing Iran. So we went over to Europe. Right. Then you have global reset 1, COVID, shutdowns, all energy supplies, everyone's on their technology, the world changes, a small group, consolidation of all the small businesses into a few large multinational institutions, bankruptcy of many, many businesses. So we enter into COVID. ESG was to say what happened as a result of ESG. Germany turns off its nuclear energy, which is the most efficient energy that would have saved the manufacturing base. And everyone starts going to climate change net zero. And we're all buying windmills and equipment from China that they can afford to run, but we can't afford to run, which creates inflationary cycles. Then you have an oil shock as a result of agitating Russia to invade Ukraine. Now the printing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're at the end of a debt cycle, right? We're printing like crazy in order to prop up the stock market, while all that value is consolidating in the hands of a fewer and fewer people who are sending the capital abroad. Now we have a problem, right? Things are getting worse. You then have civil unrest because people are saying, what the hell is going on? I can't live. I'm choosing between eating and heating, regime change Liz Truss in the UK. But anyway, let's not go into that. That was the Bank of England that took her out. And Keir Starmer, I mean, his background, like in terms of, he was involved in taking out Julian Assange and given the sex allegations.
He's a company man, right? Yeah. He's got ties to.
Yeah, absolutely. And they all are. Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak. He was the biggest investor in the Moderna, like vaccines and all sorts of stuff. Like, this is a racket. The economies in the West are a racket. We've hit the stage where it's just asset stripping, corporate raiding, and the BlackRock portfolio companies and the financial industrial complex will use the fiat currencies for as long as they can use it as collateral to extract as much value, and then usher in a surveillance state and a technocratic nightmare. The West is, that's the future of the West. Okay, so they know that. So what are they doing in this multipolar world? Well, they recognize that America dominated the Middle East. So through these operations that we discussed, you had strategic tension that allowed them to never unify. You never allow them to use their oil. That's got to be a function of the petrodollar in terms of building wealth. But when you allow China to be a manufacturing base, they build wealth. And so they become the exporter of everything. And that requires a lot of energy. So they buy it from the Middle East. Now, the Middle East is looking there saying, I've got a US foreign base here. I own significant influence over America because I co-opted the financial industrial complex through my sovereign wealth fund. Every time they do a deal or IPO, we invest. It's our money. We're propping up the data centers. We're propping up the AI trade. But now we compete with them. And they're trying to take our energy exports. So now we're in a different dynamic. The world has changed. Our money comes from China. Iran is propped up by China. Saudi's propped up by China. Qatar's propped up by China. We get some Europe, but Europe is a pretty dodgy market, right? Europe's looking pretty sketchy. And so America basically decide it's time to switch not America. I believe that the financial industrial complex said we need to switch to multipolarity. It's time to accelerate. How do we accelerate? Let's bring in Trump. So Trump comes along for a second term. Biden does the open borders, Trump does the closed borders. That manufactures civil unrest and helps Palantir build the police state. And Trump has a long-term narrative of tariffs. That's useful. What if we completely liberated the world from the dollar? So Trump does April the 2nd, 2024. Was it 24, 25? I'm losing.
25.
25. Mm-hmm. Dollar Liberation Day. Breaks everything. Every relationship that America had built up is now broken. Not only that, but he's got a brilliant narrative. He can say he's taking on the deep state. The deep state props up the dollar. So he ends National Endowment of Democracy, which is where you did all the covert regime change to prop up the dollar. He ends USAID, mm-hmm. which is how you fund all the terrorist factories and all the groups to create your militia groups around the world. He releases Epstein files, which reveals without the financial transactions, and the people that control the Epstein files are not in it, but it leverages all of our assets and purges all the assets that we don't need anymore. Remember, right now, the transactions are not coming out for the Epstein files. Bank of New York Mellon is fighting that. That tells you who controls the Epstein files. And it ain't the Department of Justice, and it ain't Trump. It's the financial industrial complex that most likely controls those. It's the money laundering networks. You don't want the transactions because that's what will actually lead to real arrests. Okay. So then you say, right, what are we doing with the Western Hemisphere? China, Iran, and Russia are in Venezuela. We need to look strong while we're getting weak. The Sun Tzu philosophy, when you're weak, look strong, project strength. We need to shrink. So we do the tariff things. all the small business go bust, consolidate power into the large companies. They go and buy the small companies that are dependent upon the exports. American business implements a new tax because that was 95% paid by American small business. The large companies, they did an offsetting transaction in their transnational capital flows. So you wipe out more small business. M&A activity on the bank's balance sheet is at all-time high. They're cashing in on the tariffs. And everybody negotiates with China. China had already won the trade war prior to Trump coming in, and tariffs was the execution of losing it while pretending you're trying to win it. And so Trump works for effectively all his money is made. If you look at his backers, number one, Elon Musk. Number two, the Bank of New York Mellon family. So you've got technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, and then Mary Madelston, Israel, which is military industrial complex, in that order. So he implements all of the surveillance state technology, says we're going to be crypto capital, does all the AI. And then for FIC, so he does that for TIC. Then for FIC, he does tariffs, which drives everyone to renegotiate with China. He becomes an agent of chaos. He destroys the fabric of everything that makes the dollar stable and the capital markets stable. True Social becomes market manipulation 101. Remember that video where he was pointing at like Charles Schwab and saying, you made $1 billion off that. You made $1 billion off that.
I must have missed that.
Yeah. There was when he was doing every tariff deal, there was someone put a camera in there and he was talking to all of his hedge fund and FIC buddies. He goes over to the Middle East, constructs, I've got $18 trillion of inbound investment. What is $18 trillion of foreign direct investment? Means you're selling your equities. So Saudi stops buying treasuries and starts buying equities. Mm-hmm. Saudi Aramco suddenly gets a board seat on BlackRock. So now the creme de la creme of the financial industrial complex is aligned with China and the Gulf countries and the sovereign wealth funds in Norway. Where all the big sovereign wealth funds in Singapore and various other factions. The world has changed. And so now we need to shrink America, maintain the dollar for as long as we can to asset strip as much as possible. And we need several events. Okay, let's negotiate with Maduro. Elon does the regime change on X, starts saying how Maduro is evil, he's killing people, rallies all the Venezuelans, we're gonna make you free, we're gonna liberate you. And then effectively, Maduro, we have this operation that's meant to make America look like the biggest, the baddest, the greatest, the best. Maduro probably made a shit ton of money. The Venezuelan stock market goes up 300%. That's owned by a few banks and probably some corrupt politician, probably Maduro. I'm sure either they co-opted everyone underneath him or he was involved in it anyway. He agrees to have this very theatrical thing. And now you've got what's meant to be the largest oil reserves. But who is actually, prior to the operation, China moved out all of its assets. China moved out, took all of its oil, put it on sea, changed its refining. Like leading up to this, China knew about it. Everyone knew about it. Russia knew about it. Iran knew about it. And then suddenly you come in, you get the drug narrative. We pretend they're taking on drugs. And then suddenly it switches to the oil narrative. Americans are happy. They're like, yeah, we're the empire. We're MAGA. We're taking over all the oil. Make America great again. Trump's doing it. Meanwhile, who's building all the infrastructure? If you look at Iraq, China was building all the infrastructure for all that oil. Halliburton was getting all the service contracts. And the Gulf countries were ending up with all of the infrastructure. So the only company that can do the refinement is 100% owned by Saudi Aramco. There was some corrupt Israelis via an M&A deal that happened prior to that managed to get a part of the contract as well. But effectively, Trump is acting as a for-rent militia in order to give resources in a multipolar world. And those Venezuelan resources, I think, were negotiated. And China doesn't react, Russia doesn't react, and Iran doesn't react. So that operation then leads to Iran. So now China, prior to this, had normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is now producing. Iran is 90% of its oil is exported to China. So they're an economic dependent. If China stops buying oil, Iran economically tumbles. All of the sovereign wealth fund that's buying all the US equities are funded by China. The Gulf countries, one by one, start having these weird wars between like UAE and Saudi. Yemen suddenly is controlled by Saudi. Turkey suddenly controls Syria. Turkey also gets its Somalia assets. UAE gets its Somaliland ports. The Kurds start being integrated into the army, and one by one, suddenly everything seems to just start working. We get all this theatrics as if they're all fighting each other, but everything starts to get resolved, and suddenly militias are being replaced by state armies in all these different places. Interesting. Israel, I think in this time, had a mission which was to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians on October the 7th. If you look at it, Iran stopped funding Hamas when there was a political arm, and the political arm was funded by Qatar, and Hamas's office were in Qatar. That's where the biggest US base is and the biggest US ally. Mm-hmm. So Qatar takes over the funding of Hamas. The banking system in Palestine only gets in via Israel. So Iran stopped funding it when it was a political arm. Then we get October the 7th. Netanyahu couldn't ethnically cleanse the Palestinians because Egypt said we won't let them out the border. IMF said we'll give you $18 billion to do it. They said no because they were backed by China and BRICS. Massive infrastructure investments from China, massive Gulf investments prior to it. So now Netanyahu is effectively can't achieve the goal that the neocons in America, the Zionists in Israel, kind of rely upon. So now we end up where there's effectively a purge. This is when the narrative, this is when X comes along and suddenly we're allowed to talk about Palestine. You get Tucker Carlson and all these people exposing and de-radicalizing evangelical Christians. Then you get Epstein files. You get all of the horrific imagery that came out from the Gaza genocide. Then people are like, what the hell's going on here? You know. Then you get the Epstein files. Oh my God, our government are run by pedophiles. Yeah. Then you get Trump switching from peace president to war president. And then suddenly we're now in an operation that is going to completely reset the world and renegotiate every single oil contract. There was a series of M&A. Qatar had already acquired the companies in Texas. Saudi had already acquired the companies in Texas. Mm-hmm. So if America gets all these oil contracts and LNG contracts to export to Europe, they're covered. So anything you lose here, you make up there. So now all of a sudden you need the final battle, right? So all this to go around. Most people think that US, Israel, and Iran are in a war. There are factions of the Middle East being run as a forever war model. Who props up the forever war model? Extreme hardliners in the IRGC, the funding of proxies that create the strategic tension and justification for Israel, and the American military funding it. That's one faction of power. The neocons in America, mm-hmm. the extreme Zionists that are military contractors, and IRGC that created a whole industry around funding the proxies that give them leverage. That's one group. On the other side, you have the financial industrial complex aligned faction of power. Who's that? The Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, China, and the reformist government and the pragmatic IRGC members that are willing to do a deal that was already being negotiated. And you have the financial industrial complex in America that has been negotiating all of their rebuild contracts in Syria, Gaza, Lebanon, all of these different countries, and want to open up Iran. Okay? So this is a battle between the final forever war transition for the military industrial complex. They get to make as much money, and their job is to drain the IRGC of all of their weapons, drain Israel of all of their defense weapons, destroy the economy of Israel, load it up with debt, and make Iran an economic dependent upon China. Do decapitation campaigns to take out those that are not on board with a deal that still profit from the military economy.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, there was a mafia that was set up within the IRGC that also benefits from the resistance economy. And then once you have a mafia and sanctions, you then work with like Russian groups and all sorts of stuff. Then you're in a power structure you can't get out of. And so that's why the forever war persisted. China wants regional stability and America to exit the region. So what happens? America allows the Gulf countries to invest in Texas and be covered for anything that happens to them. China and Russia give intelligence to the reformist and pragmatic elements of the IRGC and the government.
Mm.
And the hardliners immediately are blowing up US bases in the Gulf countries. And the Gulf are not reacting. Then you have the blowing up of oil resources and natural gas resources that pumps the price of oil to $115 after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I believe the financial industrial complex wanted the closure of Hormuz. What enforced the closure? There was no button that said we're closed. The parliament voted on it. The government, not the IRGC, voted on it. The IRGC said we'll blow up anyone that tries to pass it, but it was actually the insurance, the Lloyd's of London, that shut the Strait of Hormuz. They continued to insure the planes. They continued to fund all of the Red Sea disruption that was the same as the Strait of Hormuz, but they made it 75% and basically uninsurable in the Strait of Hormuz. That created the almighty pump and dump. So who benefits? Russia, Chevron, Exxon, and Gulf sovereign wealth funds. Russia gets to sell all of its oil and help Asia to keep things flowing for the financial industrial complex. America says, hey, Europe, you can either go to Russia or you can come to us. And then America gives sanction relief to Russia in order to get the price of oil down because it's about to break everything. At the price of oil at $160, we enter into a global financial crisis that is demand destructive to absolutely everyone. At a price of $110 per oil, we know that the FIC kick in and they start doing futures contracts. They start releasing strategic petroleum reserves, and they give sanction relief to Russia in order to get the oil price down.
What are we at now? Around about 100, isn't it?
Last time I looked before this interview, we were at 103, around about 103, 106. We need, I think, very similar to the 12-day war, a three-way victory that leads to an already predetermined outcome. And there are radicalists that in the military-industrial complex aligned faction of Israel, Iran, and America that need to be satisfied. And you'll end up with regime change in Israel. And we've already had decapitation campaigns in Iran. And the oil price sets the predetermined. Now, if this were a genuine war and there wasn't an understood deadline by the FIC, the price of gold would have been through the roof with oil. You would have oil and gold in tandem. Gold's just been flat. Like it just hasn't done anything. In fact, it's slightly down, I think.
Not yet, but we haven't seen the economic consequences flow through yet.
Correct.
So we'll see what happens on that front.
So once you get gold and oil moving in tandem, then you know we're in a situation. So now the current situation is we have oil that's between 100 and 110. There is massive futures positions that I think were taken out by US Treasury in order to oppress the price. We've had sanctions relief. So China wants this war to, Russia is the winner of the war so far. They used to sell oil at 35 to 40 cents a barrel. They're now selling it at 100 and the world needs them. And they can get oil anywhere.
Did you say 35 or 40 cents?
Yeah, they would have been, during the peak of the sanctions, they would have been, dollars, not cents.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So they would have been selling it at the peak of sanctions at a discount for that kind of price. Now they're writing checks. So
Well, they had an interesting situation with India where they were selling discounted oil to India. The US said, hey, stop that. They're sanctioned. India stops it.
Yep.
Trump later on lifts the sanctions. India says, okay, we'll buy your oil again. And I said, okay, but you're not getting a discount now.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay.
And what was the other half of that? The other half of that is there was a farming revolt in India because because India was importing its agricultural from America. And so what else does the Strait of Hormuz close? Fertilizers. And then Qatar shut the production of liquefied natural gas, which means that creates a agricultural disaster. And so now they get to buy the farmers get screwed in India, and America gets to sell its agriculture to make up for the disaster this year. They get some GDP, they get some growth, The dollar starts strengthening throughout this whole war. Bitcoin starts going up throughout this whole war. So now you reversed all the dollar weakening. The S&P performs better than all the foreign stock markets because Europe and Asia are screwed. China had already built like the largest oil reserves in the world. They also had their renewable energy and various other things. And Iran is selling record levels of gas and oil to China because it's open to China. So the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and China is open, but not for anyone else. Russia can get all of its oil everywhere. Europe gets to now, in the time frame that the strait is closed, screwed. I either buy from Russia or I buy from America. America's going to say that's going to cost you a massive premium and a 20-year contract. You get to vassalize Europe further, screwed again. Energy crisis, recession, real property crash in UK and Europe. And then America creates the full dependency. Russia is deeply integrated into Asia. So you've really split the world up into helping BRICS. Iran is effectively, the US media is saying we're kicking ass, Iran's dead. Iran is in an asymmetric war where they're getting weakened, no doubt, but the strait is still closed. And the price of oil is dependent upon America's ability to get ships through, which he keeps saying, we're done, just go through. No one's getting through. The strait is still closed. Saudi and UAE created alternative pipelines. So we got 20 million barrels that come offline. 20% of global oil supply is offline. Their alternative routes get 9 million barrels through, and then you can get the oil to China. You have split the world into multipolarity. Mission accomplished. Now you need three things in order to get rid of the military-industrial complex forever war alliance factions. You need to take out decapitation campaigns within Iran in the IRGC. Notice how everybody that was at the negotiation table prior to this, Oman had announced that the deal was done. We've got a framework. China will provide security guarantees. Russia will take the highly enriched uranium, and we'll go to zero enrichment. That was announced in Oman. Oman mediators came out saying we got the framework for a deal. And then America escalates on Saturday. And so everyone that was sat around that table, Archie, the various other, I get the name wrong, the prime minister of the reform government, Promishkov, something like that. Sorry, Prishkia, yeah. They're still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And then they replace Khomeini with Khomeini. And we'll see what comes next. But it looks like Khomeini was already cooperating. And maybe he decided that in order to get the IRGC online with China's vision, I need to go out. Israel gets his narrative. America gets his narrative. Khomeini is credible enough where, remember, the end of Iraq-Iran war was when the Grand Supreme Leader said, we have to do this. It has to end. And then they have to follow the Supreme Leader.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes down the IRGC structure.
Yep.
The IRG structure that profits from the banking cartel, the military-industrial complex, they're either gone or they're integrated. The proxies are being eliminated one by one. Israel is strategically weakened because it's going to be dumped by America or military budgets. And now it works for the FIC rather than the MIC.
Mm-hmm.
And so
does that mean that the destroyed bases in the Gulf countries are not rebuilt in America leaves?
I reckon that's the part. So I always said, in order to have peace in the Middle East, you need three things. Resolve the Palestinian cause, which is Israel. Then you need to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and you need US to exit the region. This is a US exit. They have outsourced to Iran the removal of the US bases, and now those will most likely, what was it immediately that the Gulf countries said? We're going to reconsider our investments. Yeah. What are those investments? Defense and AI. Mm-hmm. That breaks the private credit markets in the US. We get the big withdrawals. That breaks the growth potential. They need the Gulf money to come back because all of the data centers was all the growth. So you get extreme financial stress in America. They have to crash the price of oil. The only way to crash the price of oil is to give concessions to the reformist faction of the IRGC, which is going to be pushed into China because China wrote the whole game. Trump gets credit. Affinity partners is what bridged Trump. While everyone was focused on Trump being controlled by Israel, he had a multi-billion-dollar fund managed by Jared Kushner that was funded by the Gulf countries that gets him a Trump Tower across the Middle East, that gets him all of the investments that he wants. It's had 0% returned, and it's just been sat there with billions of dollars of capital managed by Jared Kushner. You get to bribe the Israeli elites that need to be bribed into allowing this to happen. And then at the end of this, you regime change Israel and put in a GCC puppet, just like you put in Syria, a GCC and Turkey puppet. They will be leftist. They will expose, they'll say, what happened on October the 7th, and they'll appease the people that have been protesting. And then who takes credit for it all? Trump, which is why he set up the border peace. Who is the border peace funded by? It's funded by the Gulf countries. And so you're going to build a technocratic Orwellian nightmare in Gaza. Israel's likely to be regime changed. The forever war comes to an end. The IRGC hardliners are taken out. The US military bases are expelled. The price of oil makes extreme stress. All of those oil and gas contracts are renegotiated. And my belief is that there are factions that are trying to derail this plan in the military-industrial complex, both in Israel, Iran, and America, the neocons, the Zionists, and the IRGC hardliners that built the war economy. And then there's China, the FIC, and the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, but they'll win. And I think they'll win at the end. The world is meant to believe this goes to World War III. I don't think it goes to World War III. If this goes on for 2 weeks and the price of oil is above $120, we're going to have extreme stress in America. Something's going to break. If they can get the price of oil down, then this can carry on a little bit longer. There is no chance of a long-term forever war. They need to crash the price of oil, and the only way to do that is to have a deal. So how do you get to a deal? My prediction is you need a three-way victory, just like the 12-Day War. America says we took out Khomeini, we've annihilated the weapons, the nuclear program is over, whether it's true or not.
Well, I tried to do that. And Iran said, we're not stopping until our objectives are met.
Yeah. But I believe there is an internal faction of both IRGC and Iran reformists that's aligned with China and moving towards regional stability. And they're doing internal regime change rather than external regime change. Because if they get regime change, that turns Iran into Syria. And that's not good for anyone. No one wants that. And so
it's good for Israel.
Well, you say that, but the destruction of America and chaos in Iran with a population of 90 million that creates a vacuum is returning to the forever war model. So it's good for the military industrial complex. It's good for the hardliners in Iran, and it's good for Israel radical Zionists that want to maintain their role, which is why I don't think if Netanyahu is dead today, my fear is that he was managing the transition of Mick to Fick. And as much as I hate that bastard, what would replace him might be Mick aligned and worse. And so there might have been an internal, I'm not sure whether he's gone or not, but if he is, it might have been an inside job from the Mick aligned faction of Israel. It might have been the Mick aligned. So Netanyahu is the less extreme version of the leaders in Israel.
You think there's worse to come?
Oh,
So Ben Gvir, Naftali Bennett, and there are a couple of others that whose names escape me.
yeah.
So we've already
Smotrich.
got Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, no less, and he's a much younger man also.
Yeah.
He's already saying once this is over, Turkey's next.
Yeah. So those represent the Mick-aligned faction that want the forever war. The forever war is do it in Iran, then do it in Turkey, continue forever. The Greater Israel Project is a narrative for Mick profits. And so it's a very complicated operation. This is a once-in-a-lifetime change, but there is a time frame on this. Because if you lose all your strategic reserves globally, your petroleum reserves, and you've got a short futures position to oppress the price, and Russian sanctions is the only thing you can do to open up oil and get it where it needs to go without entering into a global financial crisis, because a global financial crisis breaks everyone's banks because they're all connected. And that breaks the Japan carry trade and the hedge fund Cayman Island basis trade, which is rolling over the US debt. The US has to have higher growth than the average interest on its debt. The average interest rate on its debt is currently 3.3%. If it goes below 3.3%, America breaks. If it goes into a recession, it's got the largest percentage deficit it's ever had, 6%. The last time it had 6% was World War II. If you get lower growth than 3.3%, and the Japan carry trade and the hedge fund Cayman basis trade breaks, and you have an oil crisis that leads to inflation, and you're paying a higher interest rate on the debt because the long-term rates are going up globally now as a result of this, you would end up with a reduction of tax revenue that would put America's deficit from 6% to 15%, which is unprecedented and breaks America. You have to crash the price of oil, and you need to have done it yesterday. That's reality.
We touched on the petrodollar deal between United States and Saudi Arabia, and now that we've seen Iran obliterate all the bases, and in fact America utilize resources, repurpose and redistribute resources from those bases to Israel. What does that do to the petrodollar? Doesn't that undermine its very existence?
Yes, by design. This was the operation. So they broke the euro dollar, they broke the Japan carry trade, and now they're breaking the petrodollar. So now the problem is that the currency is strengthening from this war. They need it to go back to where it was. So they need a deal. And then once you hit a deal, foreign stock markets will start outperforming the S&P again, and foreign currencies will start outperforming the dollar. Now you have returned to the dollar strengthening, which is a problem. So now you need to return. Once you return, then you can sell your treasuries, you can buy gold, and you can remove your pegs to the dollar over time in this managed transition. The second the Strait is open again, we are in a completely different world to the one we were before. We're already in a completely different world. This is going to take months of supply chain issues. There's fertilizers, there's all sorts of stuff. There's all the enrichment. There's South Korea can't make a semiconductor chip because it's got certain components. Everyone's focused on oil. We're already in COVID level of disruption if it opens today. But if this stays closed for another 2 weeks, it can't stay closed for 2 months. If it's closed for 2 months and the price of oil hits 150 or above, we're in global financial crisis, recession, just worse than 2008. Everything breaks. And I know the FIC doesn't want that, so I don't think they'll let it get there.
Yeah. So that's demand destruction, right?
Correct.
And
you got it right.
Down.
So it's inflation as a result of oil price.
Yeah.
Then it hits the price where no one can afford anything, so they stop consuming. Then it's demand destruction, which is a deflationary spiral and recession. Exactly what happened during inflation is transitory, Biden going to MBS, saying flood the market, all that stuff.
That's why I think, Larry Lepard's The Big Print, that's coming.
The big print is coming, and maybe the big taking is coming as well, the great taking. Those predictions are likely to come true. There is no alternative but big print after this. Yeah. And the big print will be return to fiscal dominance, weakening of the dollar, and then capital outflows and multipolar world. Anyway, we are in, as soon as the Strait is open, we're back to dealing with the fallout. But we are in a multipolar world. The US empire is over officially today. There's no returning to it.
Yeah.
If there's one exception, if America, which I don't think is the goal, is actually doing what MAGA think they're doing, which is occupy the oil and take over Iran and force Iran onto the dollar. But if you look at the sanctions contract between Russia when they give the sanction relief, it wasn't demanding the dollar. Those were priced in foreign currencies as well as dollar. So there's only two ways this goes. Mick wins, in which case they occupy, the American empire is stronger than ever and everything's priced in dollars. Or Fick wins, which means that America is now a regional power. We're in multipolar world order. The war ends. The IRGC is maintained, but they are normalized between China and effectively, if you look at the word Middle East, what was that? That was the London colonizers looking eastwards and saying that's the middle of the world. Prior to that, it was called West Asia. The Middle East is now West Asia. It's done. There's no reversal.
So the petrodollar's dead?
The petrodollar is in a managed transition, and they don't want to break anything, but they'll do the same as what they did with the pound.
An American empire, it's the beginning of the end.
Yes.
They will not rebuild their bases.
They may negotiate some kind of contract and dependency based upon tick power. They may say, get some AI there, get some cybersecurity there. We'll get you to buy weapons, but those weapons will be hedged with China and Russia, I think. Probably even Iran eventually. But the purpose of them is not to serve Israel and the US empire because China rules the game. And China will not allow a US proxy Israel to destabilize the region. It will not allow Gulf countries to have US bases that are there for destabilization. And it will not allow Iran to go hardliner and, get back to strategic tension between Iran and Israel.
So
China rules the game, Trump takes credit.
Iran right now is under severe global sanctions because of the US. What is their predicament after this war?
The golden crown, based upon strategic targets being met, proxies being eliminated, milestones being set, which China will set, and by the way, in April, we got the Xi Jinping Trump meeting.
Mm-hmm.
They're leading up to that.
That's like
that's
2.5 weeks away.
Yes.
2 weeks away. Yeah.
Which is perfect timing for how quick this has to be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll find out whether I'm wrong or right based upon whether the petrodollar is maintained through taking over Iran, occupying
Well,
Iran.
you would expect that they would have an outline of a deal to be ratified at that meeting, right?
This deal has been negotiated over 7 years. It started with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It started with the October the 7th. It continued with the elimination or the stopping and support of proxies. This has been a long-term negotiation. The deal was already done and Trump was installed to execute. That's why Trump, he's so inconsistent right now. He doesn't know what's coming next. His PR outfit is so inconsistent because he doesn't know what's happening. He's not running this war. He's not making decisions. This is being run by the deep state. This is the MIC. This is the FIC. This is the intelligence networks. This is negotiations with China. Trump is just the PR man. And everyone's saying, is Trump gone crazy? No, he hasn't gone crazy. He just doesn't know what's coming next. He's being told on a need-to-know basis, I think. These are middle management. Same with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is just there for personal survival.
So on Iran, you think the sanctions will be lifted and their entrance into the world will be renormalized?
Yeah, the big ticket is for FIC to get as much, maybe a bit of Strait of Hormuz so that they can guarantee it doesn't happen again. No closure. Opening up of markets in Syria and Iran. That would be how they make up for lost returns with the fall of the US empire. Iran and Syria in the center of the world without MIC destabilizing the region with vast energy moving into an AI and robotics and nuclear powered world. That's where they make up
I can imagine Iran being at least the equivalent of Turkey. They're certainly more educated than the Turkish population, for example. And so why can't their productive capacity be equal to or greater than Turkey's?
Iran is a powerhouse. If you open up sanctions, they got the army, they've got the resources, they've got the education, they've got the cultural background, they've got historical, that's why it had to be shut down. That's why they had to contain Iran. This has been 100 years of colonization from the British Empire to the American Empire. You can never let Iran and the Gulf countries unify, back it by China and Russia. That's the end of the US empire. And that world will have a lot less war. A lot less war. It would be a much better world. I think competition, regional stability, and the end of this demonic MIC-led empire. But it's dangerous because BlackRock is still the largest asset manager in the world. And the capital markets, you've got 5 trillion of sovereign wealth there. China's got all the capital. But FIC want to be glued together to make money from regional stability. And I think that was the plan. And I'm very bullish on the rest of the world. I think the West is going to get worse and worse. I think Africa is going to be able to rise. I think the Middle East is going to be the highest growth. And I think China won't be a dominant empire because India will build a manufacturing base. Other one will have.
We've been waiting for India for 25 years. Since China emerged as an economic global power, people have been looking at India to emerge. And what's happened?
India and UAE are thick infiltrations of the Middle East and BRICS. So they want to vassalize India and UAE as much as possible so that they can get, and Israel, they're vassalizing Israel, UAE, and India. That's why we had this, the Pakistan-India little writ. And then you had all the defense agreements between Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And then an alternative front was formed between UAE, India, and Israel. And these are to try and create strategic tensions. This UAE, India, Israel represents FIC now. It used to represent MIC. Israel used to represent MIC. I think UAE and Saudi are playing good cop, bad cop. UAE takes the reputational hit because you get to buy all of the Israeli assets through the normalization agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And India gets to buy the Mossad military industrial complex. And India and China probably becomes the next future strategic tension.
So we spoke earlier about the exodus of millionaires from the United Kingdom, and you just mentioned the UAE. So I guess it's an opportune time to mention Dubai. Dubai gets a lot of attention for all sorts of reasons, and they've done a tremendous job of generating alternative. I mean, people still think that they make their money from oil, which they don't. They don't at all. They don't. Is it even 5 or 10%?
No,
it's basically zero, right?
Yeah, it's a Fink powerhouse.
Yeah. It is a financial powerhouse, but it does seem that this U.S.-Israeli war on Iran has burst that bubble.
Yeah, I doubt it. Firstly, if you look at the deals in Texas, they were hedged to benefit from. In the US asset stripping exercise, Qataris and Saudis certainly. But UAE is too strategically important to Fink. UAE is their mechanism for trying to get a grip hold in the region. And so what's happened? The price of real estate has corrected like 30%, I think they're saying.
Yep, last I checked.
But look at the deals. Institutional investors are buying it off retail. Institutions see the future. They don't think this is systemic. Fink is going to buy up everything they can buy up into this weakness and make it a vassal so that they can apply tension to Saudi. Because Saudi has now got BlackRock's head office. It's got a bunch of the banks. It did a dollar-denominated bond through a Chinese investment bank. It opened up its stock market prior to this to foreign investors. And it started being the one that was pushing back against Israel. It was the one that said, we're not going to normalize and join Abraham Accords until there's a Palestinian cause. So Saudi is the kingpin of the GCC. UAE is the bulldog. And Qatar has the European relationships. And all of them are an intermediary between Chinese capital and BRICS capital and Asian capital and the financial industrial complex of the West. They're going to sit in the middle with a tax haven, and Fink want to turn UAE into their playground, so they want to buy it all. So this is just a distressed asset acquisition of the UAE.
So what do you think Jared Kushner is doing right now, where he's coincidentally, perhaps opportunistically, raising a fund and he's doing a tour of the Middle East, looking to raise $5 billion? Is this him putting the hat out?
Yeah.
Or let's just say, let's use a different term. Is he wetting the beak,
yes,
to use a Godfather theme, before the deals are actually finalized?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what happens. Remember what you have, like in Syria. Do you remember there was so the head of ISIS became like the placeholder president, Gilani. Mm-hmm. He went to meet Trump at the White House. Mm-hmm. Trump was putting perfume on the head of ISIS. That just shows you how this world really works. And then what happened? Trump went to meet all the banks. The banks started to front run all of the deals in Syria. And then you had the narrative, oh, they're killing the Christians. They're killing the Christians. And all that BS. So they created all of the destabilization narrative in the West. There was an uprising of one of the proxies. They then said, that's the Muslims killing the Christians, even though it was all the different factions. And they were trying to contain an old faction of power that was aligned with the Assad. Mm-hmm. And then they did all the deals into that weakness. So they're trying to make it like Syria's about to be taken over by Israel and it's always going to be in a war and it's going to return to 2011 dirty war. While they buy up as much as they can, then they'll do sanctions relief and then they'll open up.
Well, they did take Syrian land.
Yes.
They did annex more Syrian land, including one of the mountains which has a ski resort on it in the Middle East of all places. So,
and I think that is Netanyahu being useful to the Fink, knowing that these deals are going to be done and he needs to negotiate that he doesn't go to prison. and that all of his crimes against humanity go away. And so he's been leveraging his utility, gain as much land as possible while they push the Greater Israel narrative. And then that's all going to be strategically acquired via these negotiations. And Jared Kushner, what's his role? His role is to take all of the Gulf money and also get all the Zionist oligarchs and billionaires that need to be bribed or financially benefit from regional stability so that they stop working for Mike and get rid of all the Mike people that aren't on board and all the radicals. It's. I think that's how it's going to play out over the next 5 years.
And you know, Bitcoin. How does that play into all of this? Because you know, we've got gold, we've got oil. What happens to Bitcoin?
Accumulate. Whether they've accumulated enough. I think there was massive manipulation. I started looking into the Jane Street allegations.
Do you think it was a coincidence that as soon as Jane Street was issued notice that they're under investigation for market manipulation on another matter, that, you know, I think this is what Zero Hedge was posting about, that they basically, you know, pulled their heads in and stopped what they were doing on Bitcoin?
I think I did an investigation. The whole 10 a.m.
The 10 a.m. slam that the
10
Zero
a.m.
Hedge was
slam.
calling it. Yeah.
There were days that's done, but it wasn't consistent. There were more days.
It doesn't need to be every single day.
Correct.
But there was clearly a pattern at 10 a.m. on the dot.
Correct.
On many, many days.
And they were being investigated for that in India, South Korea, and China. And
when you say that's market manipulation in general, right?
For that exact structure of taking an ETF construct, being an appointed representative, being able to print the Bitcoin ETF or the silver ETF shares, and then having a time frame until you've got to match it with the underlying.
Yep.
And then using media manipulation to push out stories. And then buy spot and sell significantly more futures so that you can pump the price and then push it back down, and then come buy in and accumulate a position. But we don't know, on the bit about Jane Street's balance sheet is we don't know. We know that they're the largest holder of IBIT Bitcoin ETF, but because they're a private company, we don't know what the other side of their derivatives are. And also, I started investigating a bit. This is not conclusive, but we've got all these investigations that don't happen in the US, but do happen in India, South Korea, and China, implying to me that it's a potential protective class of FIC. But also, if you look at the founder, the information on this company is very hard to come by, but the founder was once fined for giving $7 million to pay for a coup in Sudan. So that implies to me that he claimed that it was just, he thought it was humanitarian aid, but he was effectively funding a coup in Sudan. There's suspicion to me that this is a protected institution, and it is the mechanism for price manipulation. And it seems, remember the whole thing we were talking about Bitcoin and Epstein and MIT? Remember, that's the same MIT and DCI that Gary Gensler came from. And Gary Gensler, who was chair of the SEC, whilst allowing Operation Choke Point 2.0 to happen for the financial institutions, and also meeting SBF and no one else in the industry to write the regulations that made the foundation for Clarity Act and Genius Act today. So there is definitely a FIC protected class. The same people that we don't know were shorting stocks and before 9/11. These same financial operations. And I've got a feeling that Howard Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald is probably one of those institutions. And the fact that he got a role in the Trump administration, while Steve Witkoff, a mob New York real estate tycoon, connected to Israel, and also made a loan to Urban Movers, which was the front company that did the bombing in 9/11 that was covered in the FBI documents. Everyone around the Trump administration seems to be from these things. But he became envoy to the Middle East, and he became a shareholder in World Liberty Financial. And remember CZ, when he got taken out for 4 months, they installed a compliance team that took over all the data. And then they started shutting down all the Turkish accounts, Lebanese accounts, and Palestinian accounts as part of the genocide financial warfare, as requested by Israel. So you can see that there's been infiltration into these different things. But World Liberty Financial is Steve Witkoff and Trump. And then you've got the Bitcoin treasury companies and Cantor Fitzgerald. All of the money laundering behind these bribes from Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund that led to them becoming a shareholder in Binance, that led to the pardon of CZ. These are all happening by a Trump stablecoin, World Liberty Financial. And the only thing that's stopping Clarity Act coming through right now is that the Democrats are looking at all this corruption and saying this is problematic. So yeah, the country's run by mafia and pedophiles. Europe's going to be really struggling. American empire is over, but if you're rich and you've got assets, you'll be on the right side of the K-shaped economy. It's still the most liquid market. I think Africa might be able to use its resources. I think the Middle East is going to be the highest growth region. I think the world under China, I hope, won't be regime change similar to America. I think they'll just trade and say you run your country how you want. And there'll be massive competition. And I think strategic tension between India and China is like the next thing that we need to watch. And where does Bitcoin sit in that? I couldn't think of anywhere I'd rather be than self-custody, running a node with a digital asset that I can send to anyone at scale, that I can take to me in any country, wherever I go. And I think the financial institutions know that. That's why they try to accumulate and centralize as much of it as possible. And that's why they try to infiltrate as much control grids as possible. And Bitcoin is stronger than it's ever been. So I don't care about the price. Use the price opportunity to build a 10-year plan, measure your wealth in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than last month, enjoy any price go down. And if this turns out that one of these crazies are going to blow up a nuke, everything's going to crash, and it's gold in your hand and Bitcoin in self-custody. That's the only thing that's going to help you.
That's a perfect time to just wrap this up. And Simon Dixon, thank you very much.
What a few months. Thanks,
Yeah.
Archie.
Thanks, man.